It was right after I got off the ark, and you had just been born, I think. So
Yeah. I was a fetus. You were no.
This podcast is sponsored by nobody. I am paying for all of this myself. There is no sponsor, sorry. The following interview you're about to hear was recorded over Zoom. Enjoy!
First of all, if you don't mind, just kind of introducing yourself, who you are, what you do, how you got inspired to become, involved in the things that you're involved in, and then tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about tonight.
yeah, absolutely. I am thrilled to be here. And for those that don't know, my name is Scot Loyd, and I am a professor of communications at a small private university in the Midwest, in Oklahoma specifically. And I've been here for about 5 years, and I was brought here specifically to restart the debate program. So you and I actually have a connection with debate going
Yes.
back in the day when I was teaching at another college in Louisiana and coaching debate there. And that's how you and I met.
Mhm.
And so I kind of split that up with pastoring a church and leading a church in Northeast Arkansas. Did that for 5 years, but now I'm back in the academy and just teaching communications and absolutely loving what I'm doing.
I still can't believe it's been probably 10 years now, 11 years, maybe more than that. Let's see. I started debate in 2010. So at least 10 years since we were first on the circuit together. So wow, like it's been forever.
It was right after I got off the ark, and you had just been born, I think. So
Yeah. I was a fetus. You were no. So you, for this particular episode of the podcast, you had a specific topic that you wanted to discuss, and I'll let you kind of introduce that and explain what it is that you're going to tell us about.
Yeah. So this past week, my father passed away, and he was 93 years old. And so obviously it was inevitable. We all get up into age, but he certainly had an amazing life, sort of a quiet life that he lived there in rural Arkansas where we grew up. And I had the honor of eulogizing my dad this past week. And it was an amazing time. Friends and family coming together to honor a man that rarely traveled beyond Northeast Arkansas, where we grew up. So just for context, geographically, we grew up in Northeast Arkansas, about an hour north of Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah, I grew up in Northwest Arkansas. That's a small world.
Right. Yeah, you were actually a hillbilly.
Yes.
We were so poor that we couldn't have the hills, so we were just billies. So,
Just the Billy.
right, it was flat land as far as the eye could see. So right below the boot heel of Missouri, and my dad had a little piece of land there that was given to him by his mother, and he built a house from the floor up. And my mom actually told the story how he went and he and his brother collected nails and lumber from a house that they tore down. And they used every one of those nails and every one of those planks to build a house from the floor up. And it was the same house that I grew up in, that my siblings grew up in, and that he lived in right up until the end. And my mom is still enjoying that quality house all of these years later. So it really is an amazing testament to his skill as a carpenter and growing up in a time when they didn't have a lot of resources. He really was innovative in how he could come across these things. And I joked at the funeral that, my dad witnessed the invention of Tupperware, the invention of the credit card, and the invention of hairspray, none of which he ever used. He had no use for those.
Right.
But he witnessed all of them, and was just an amazing father. And he was he was the strong, silent type. So, it was that John Wayne era, where you didn't apologize for anything, and you didn't have to apologize for anything because you didn't say anything.
Right. That's awesome. That's good.
So, there were times that I really felt like I needed to say I love you to my dad, because I was the baby in the family. So the closest sibling to me is my sister, and she was 10 years older than I was. And then I have two older brothers that are basically old enough to be my father. I just turned 50 this year. And so I was, for all effects and purposes, an only child growing up. My mom was 40 when I was born, and my dad was 7 years older than she was. So he was
Wow.
approaching 50. Yeah. So I tell people that when I came along, they were just tired.
Yeah. And that's not wrong. I bet that's not wrong.
And so every once in a while, I would get and I was always a thinker and less of a doer. And so I would be inspired by something I would hear at church or something that I would see on television. And I would be like, I must express my feelings to my father. And my father had no concept or context for any of this. So I remember one time we had one bathroom in the house, and he was in the bathroom taking care of the business that you take care of in the bathroom. And I got the nerve up to walk in there, and I was like, today is the day I'm going to tell my father that I love him. And so I walk into the bathroom, and I'm standing in front of the mirror in the sink, and my dad is over there doing what you would do in the bathroom, standing there silently. This was so awkward. I'm standing there silently, and my dad is silent. Nothing is happening. And I look at myself, my reflection in the mirror, and I say, Dad, nothing, no response. Dad, I love you. Nothing. And so I walk out real quick. So that was the first time. I was probably around, 13 or 14 at the time. But what was amazing is, as my dad got older, he really started saying those words, I love you. And to be fair, it was sort of in response to when myself or my mom or one of my siblings would say those words to him. And it was like, love you. Most of the time it was, I love you, Dad. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it was better than what it was, but really understanding his context and how he grew up. He grew up without a father, amazingly, and earned a living without an education. He didn't have an education beyond the first grade. So never learned to read and write. But was very good with numbers and was very good with math. He worked at the same factory for 37 years. It was Randall Textron. They made the chrome parts for automobiles. He was a member of the United Auto Workers, a Democrat, a lifelong Democrat in a very conservative part of the country.
That's interesting. Do you know why? Like why? Because everything you're setting up you would assume he was a Republican or very conservative. Do you know why he was a Democrat?
Yeah, so we had lots of these conversations around the table, especially when Bill Clinton was elected president back in the 90s. At the time, I was when I was coming of age in the 1980s, I was very influenced by Ronald Reagan. So I drank the Kool-Aid, and I was a flag-waving Republican at 12 years old. In fact, I entered these oratorical contests, and I would quote Reagan, and I would talk about how great it was. I was devastated when Bill Clinton was elected president. And I was like, what are we going to do now? And so my dad and I, we would have these conversations around the dinner table. And I think he was very influenced by his youth. So he grew up in the Depression era. He was born in 1928. And so when he was coming of age during the Great Depression, FDR effectively saved the country, saved them. There were many work programs, food programs. And so I think when you live through something like that, the Democrats gained a loyalty from my dad that he never reneged on in his entire life.
Wow. That is
Yeah.
so interesting. Just because, not to stereotype, but just the profile that you set up, you would just assume, I think people would just assume that he was very conservative. So that's so interesting.
Yeah, it
That's
really, really was. And we had some great conversations. My dad liked politics. He paid attention to
Mhm.
what was happening in Washington, D.C., always had something to say. And of course, I think he was very influenced by his activism in the union, the United Auto Workers. I remember him going to those kinds of meetings and coming home and expressing opinions to my mom. So I like to think that maybe I gained a little bit of that political knack from him, at least always having an opinion about everything and being very interested in what was going on. And it's amazing, we kind of came full circle. So I went through my Republican phase, and now I'm certainly embracing Democratic politics now as I'm older and have witnessed a great transformation and evolution in my thought. So there at the end, my dad and I were voting the same way. For a long time, we were just
Interesting.
canceling each other out, so we should have just both stayed home.
Yeah, yeah. That's so interesting. And I definitely agree with you. I feel like, especially being young in Arkansas, I feel like you almost have to go through your mandatory conservative Republican phase. And it
Yeah.
isn't until you're older and maybe in college and people start actually asking you, why do you think that? Tell me why you think that. Or, maybe when you're older than that, that you either start to still believe you're the conservative Republican, but now you have evidence and reason to back it up, or you realize the whole time you've actually been a Democrat, like the whole time, and everything you actually believe is very Democrat leaning or left leaning. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, so that was one of the few things that my dad and I had in common. He was very skilled with his hands. He could put machines together and put them back together in working order. In fact, that was his job at the factory. They would call him in to repair the machines and get them up and running. And he did all of this, remember, with little more than going to school in the first grade. He couldn't read an instruction manual, so he just had to get in there and figure it out. And then skill in building houses and working on cars and automobiles. And we always had cows and animals that he raised and took care of. So, I like to think that had he had the education and the wherewithal to do that, there is no telling what he could have accomplished. Very highly intelligent,
Yes.
person. And he had a way about him. Like Frank Sinatra sang, he did it his way.
Yeah.
And he expected everyone else to do it his way as well. For my dad, there was one way of doing things, and it was his way. And famously, he would manage all of the money for the household, and he would buy all of the groceries. He would cook a lot of the meals. So that is a way that he was very different and cut across the stereotype as well. Especially as he got older, he took on all of those household responsibilities of cleaning the house and taking care of the house and cooking all of the meals. Was a tremendous cook, a very talented cook. But I remember whatever we would eat would be whatever was on sale at the grocery store that week.
Yep.
So, for
Yep.
instance, if we got ice cream, it was always black cherry ice cream.
Yep.
I don't know what it is about black cherry ice cream.
Always on sale.
They were trying to boost sales or what they were trying to do, but it was always on sale, and we always had it in abundance. And then the soft drinks, when we got soft drinks, it was whatever was on sale that week. So one week it might be Pepsi, the next week Coke, the next week Dr. Pepper, and then on the rare occasion it was Sprite or Mountain Dew or Mellow Yellow. And so it was just all an abundance of diversity when it came to what we were eating and what we were drinking. With the exception of Friday night. Friday night was always fish night, and it wasn't because we were Catholic. It was because my dad enjoyed fishing, and we would always fry catfish.
Whoa, that sounds
Yeah,
good.
lots of fried food growing up. It's a wonder that I didn't die of a heart attack at 12,
Right.
because I ate so much fried food. But tremendous, tremendous cook. And um, he always got us what we needed. Rarely did he get us what we wanted. And that extends to my mom as well. I remember one year for Christmas, we're all sitting there, and you got to remember how my dad operated on Christmas. So on Christmas Eve, in our household, it was tradition we'd open presents on Christmas Eve. So
Same. Is that an Arkansas
yeah,
thing?
maybe, I
It
don't
must
know.
be.
And it was horrible for us kids, right? Because the family would come over and we would eat, and of course, as kids, you're always anxious. It's time to open the presents, but the adults
Right.
are always taking their time, stretching it out. And my dad, we would finish with supper and get ready to open the presents, and he would say, "I've got to make a Walmart run." And that is when he would go and he would purchase the gifts that he was going to give that Christmas. And one year we were all sitting and opening presents, and it's my mom's turn, and she's opening the big present from my dad, and it's a big box, and it's actually wrapped, and we're all like, "Wow, this is amazing!
Whoa.
Something's up right here." And
Yeah.
so he's opening it, and he got her a leaf blower.
Very romantic. Very
Absolutely.
romantic.
Absolutely. And I remember the laughs that ensued. Both my mom and my dad were laughing, and it was hilarity all the way around. So my dad was a quirky person in his own way, even though
Yeah.
even though he didn't say a whole lot. There were different things that he would do that would surprise you from time to time. And so to see him pass, and he was vaccinated, but he had some trouble standing, and so we made the difficult decision that he needed to go to the nursing home so that he could be cared for, because my mom and he were still living together, and she wasn't in a good position to care for him, and he was in there for several months. It was funny. I went home in October, and the big drama was that after entering the nursing home, my dad was convinced that someone stole his teeth, and they were gone.
Well, did they? They could have.
To this day, we don't know. I'm convinced that maybe there's a geriatric black market for teeth,
I'm saying
and like a mafia of sorts in the nursing home.
a black market dental school who needs things to work on and practice on.
Exactly. I mean, I wanted to investigate and line everybody up and make sure the teeth fit. I don't know what they would do with them, but so they went missing. The teeth were gone. Thankfully, my sister, who is a hard-nosed detective, did some investigative work and gave the director of the nursing home a talking to, and my dad's teeth were found. They were discovered, and in the last moments of his life, he got to enjoy his teeth.
Did they say where they found them?
I believe they found them in a cabinet. They were locked, and somebody had taken them because they were in a pink cup, and my dad wouldn't have a pink cup to keep his teeth. So they had disappeared. But my sister, along with the director, they found them, found his teeth, and then of course the next day his shoes went missing.
The man can't win. There's some thief out there, though. I feel like we need to get to the bottom of who this thief is.
Exactly. And so in the nursing home, unfortunately, even though he'd been vaccinated, he contracted COVID pneumonia, and they moved him to the hospital. But to the end, his mind was sharp. He was very aware of what was happening, and we all sort of feel like that. He waited for the family to gather around him, and just sort of felt like that it was time. And it was a very moving moment, and a good one for our family. And the family came in for the funeral, and it was a good time. It was, as you might imagine, there was some grief and some sorrow, but there was also lots of laughter. And one story that I didn't get a chance to tell at the funeral that I wanted to kind of share with you and your audience. By the way, my dad, he wouldn't understand what we're doing. He would be like, What do you mean? You're having a conversation about me, and people tune in to listen to you two have a conversation. It would be difficult to explain.
Yeah, strangers who've never met any of you.
Right, are having a conversation about this man that they've never met.
Yes.
So it's kind of comical to think about him actually seeing and listening to this. But after my dad turned 90, I believe he had already passed his 90th birthday. And so my mom and dad, they sort of live on this tract of land right below the boot heel of Missouri. In fact, you can walk to the state line, and it's a little, we in Northeast Arkansas, we call them ditches. It's the state line ditch. It's what the Army Corps of Engineers would have dug out and to offset flooding from the Mississippi River. And across that is Missouri. So you could actually stand there on the property, on the levee, and look across into Missouri. And on the other side of that is this tract of land that my grandmother was given after my grandfather, who died at an earlier age. And my dad tells the story all the time with a smile on his face. He got his tooth pulled, and he died of a tooth pull. Blood poisoning set in. Yeah.
Might as well just left the tooth in there, I guess.
Exactly. And so apparently they were, I don't know all of the details, but what I can gather, the dentist may have given my grandmother some money, and they were able to purchase this land, or it was given to them. I don't know exactly, but they had to clear this land. And so it's where my dad built that house right next to my grandmother. My aunt and her husband lived there. My brother lives there to this day with his wife. And so we affectionately call it Lloydsville. We have a sign and everything, and it's population 20 at the end of a gravel road. So yeah, if you're ever looking for an amazing getaway, Lloydsville. Really cheap. And so, my dad famously, he cared for this land, would have gardens, and would take care of the land. So he's in his 90th year, I believe it was, or close to it. And my cousin is living out there at the time with her and her husband, and they had just built a house on the tract of land, and they see a fire, small fire at first, and then gradually it gets bigger and bigger, and then it's a raging inferno. My dad came up with the idea that he's going to burn away all of the dead grass in order to get rid of all of the vermin, or the mice and the rats. They're fleeing for their lives. But this fire gets out of control, and it's getting closer to the house. And my dad is on a riding lawnmower trying to cut pieces to stop the fire, and he's going in and out. And my mom is watching this in terror. Smoke is billowing. You can see it for miles in the flatland. And my cousin Judy says that at one point they see all of this fire and all of this smoke, and then out of the smoke comes these two headlights, and my dad on this tractor, like some guy out of an apocalyptic dystopian movie, emerges from the smoke, and it is just absolutely out of control. So finally my brother arrives, and I mean, they are surrounded by fire everywhere. And they call the local fire department, and they come and they turn on the fire hoses, and they're able to put it out. And unfortunately for my dad, apparently starting a fire like that is against the law. And so the county sheriff shows up with a police entourage. And my brother is in the living room with my mom and my dad, having to intercede and run interference for my dad to keep him from getting arrested.
Really?
Fire. And so the sheriff, thankfully, it was a family friend, someone that we had connections with.
Yeah.
And they gave my dad a good talking to, and of course, my dad is defiant to the end, right? This is his property. Don't tread on me.
Yeah, this is Lloydsville. He is the
Exactly.
king and the sheriff and the
Right.
mayor.
Absolutely. You're out of your jurisdiction here, right?
Right, right.
And so he avoided jail time
That's
and
good.
and got off with a warning. And thankfully, no animals were injured. I think a lot of mice lost their homes that day due to the actions of my dad. But that gives you a glimpse into the man that James Roy Lloyd was. It was funny,
Yeah.
We knew him as Dad, but then lots of family members would call him Roy, but his business name was James. So at the factory, people would call him James. And so it was like, do you know James? I know Roy.
Yeah.
So, you know Roy? I know James. It was James Roy Lloyd. And depending on where he was at or who he was around, he would use both names interchangeable. So that was the amazing man that was my dad.
That's awesome. You mentioned when you were younger that he was kind of a man of few words. What were his love languages? Like, what were the kind of things that he would do or he would say that you knew your dad loved you, even though he didn't maybe use the word love to describe it? Do you have any memories like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, it would have to be acts of service. My dad was always working. There was never a time that he wasn't doing something. In the winter, he would be building things. I remember one winter in particular, he was remodeling the house, so he was always doing that. And he came in the back door, and he was out there with a table saw, and he had his hand kind of held like this, and he said, "I cut my finger off." And so I was little, and from what I remember, the finger was dangling. So it was dangling by a piece of skin. He had caught the tip of another finger. Yeah. So, and so he lost the index finger completely. So we would
So
all
he wasn't doing like one of these tricks or anything. He legitimately cut off his finger.
When he was making a point, he was doing this all the time. So, but after he cut the finger off, he comes in and he wraps it up. He's in the bathroom for a while. We're like, what is going on with my dad? He cleans up, he takes a bath. We get ready to take him to the hospital because obviously it needs attention. And he says, before we go, I'm going to sit down and drink me a Coke. So he sits down at the kitchen table, has a Coke. There was no urgency with this man ever.
He's like gushing blood, drinking a Coke.
Yeah, exactly. He was never in a hurry for anything. We would get in the car to go on a family trip or go to a restaurant to eat, and we'd all be sitting there waiting for my dad. My dad would actually get in the car, sit down, and the notion would strike him that maybe he had to visit the bathroom before we left. So he would get out of the car, go to the bathroom. We're all continuing to wait. So he was always doing something for us. That was his love language. In the winter, he was building things. In the spring and the summer, he was tending to his garden. He always had a huge garden, lots of peas, okra, squash, tomatoes, you name it. My dad could grow it and grow it in abundance. We had so many vegetables that as when he retired from the factory, he would bag them up and he would make trips around the community and he would sell them door to door to earn extra money. And he would do these things for us just out of the blue. For instance, when I got old enough to drive in the 1980s, you're too young to remember this, but maybe some of your listeners will. In the 1980s, for a few years there was a television show, and it was Lee Majors, who was like the $6 Million Man, and he was Heath on the Big Valley. And then he played the fall guy. He was a Hollywood stuntman, and he drove this truck, this 4x4 truck. And all of us teenagers were wanting 4x4s like that. And so they were jacked up, and we would go out there in the country and we would go mudding and we would get stuck and pull each other out. And of course, I'm this nerd of a kid and have no expectation of ever driving anything like that. And one day my dad comes in driving this truck that looks just like what the fall guy is driving on TV. And he says, "Here you go." And I'm the coolest kid ever because
What?
now I'm driving this jacked up truck and I weighed all of 90 pounds soaking wet.
Yeah.
And I'm behind the wheel of this truck and I'm hanging with my friends, getting stuck and mudding and having a great time. So my dad would do things like that out of the blue that you would never expect him to do.
Wow. So you got to keep the truck? He wasn't just borrowing it for the day. He brought
No,
the
I
truck.
actually I drove it for all of my junior and senior year. And I drove it in the homecoming parade for our little school, and
That's
cheerleaders were in
awesome.
the back. And yeah, I was cool there for a few months because of the
That's
truck.
awesome. What would you say if you had to pick one, and it may be hard to pick, what would you say is either the most important or the one you use the most, lessons that you learned from your dad?
That's a great question.
Because I feel like one might be very important, but another one might be, the most relevant or usable in your life, or maybe that's the same lesson.
Yeah, the most important lesson that I learned from my dad, and my sister pointed this out, my dad was incredibly patient. He was patient to a fault. So if he was going to do something, he was going to do it right. And I think all of us sort of live in this day and age where society wants us to be in a hurry, and it isn't conducive to slowing down and taking our time and
Yep.
really getting something right. But my dad had a knack for not being concerned about what time it was, but actually focusing on the job and seeing it through to completion and seeing it through to perfection. So, I mean, it was wonderfully done. He had a great craftsmanship. And so I like to think that that is an important lesson that I learned from him. I rarely get it right. I usually get in a hurry, but I do have the ability at times, especially for things that I'm passionate about, to slow down and to focus on the work that is in front of me. And so that was a very important lesson that I learned from him. And one of the most, I guess, what was the second part you had asked about?
Oh, I was asking if the most important and the most useful, or the one you use the most, were the same lesson.
Yeah.
If they were two
So
different
so
lessons.
that would the patience would probably be the most important. The most useful is that because I'm very different from my dad and very vocal and communication is my thing. I really am learning, especially as I get older, that there was a lot of wisdom in not saying anything. And my dad
And that's
knew
the hardest one. The
exactly.
hardest one.
Exactly, because if you're wired to communicate, you feel like that communication can solve everything. But sometimes communicating can actually contribute to making matters worse.
Yep.
And so, I'm still learning that lesson.
Yes.
But that was a very useful lesson that I hope to apply better in the future.
Yes. I feel like especially for people like you and me, where our whole entire lives our identities are founded upon communication, when we know the best move is to just be quiet,
Yeah.
it's the most painful thing we can possibly experience. So wow, that's a really important and good lesson. I feel like both of those are just as important. And then the last thing I'll ask you about your dad is, what was it that you did? What was a time that you were like, oh my gosh, I sounded just like my dad, or I'm becoming my dad? Was there ever a time that you said anything or did anything or made a decision and you had to stop and literally be like, I'm becoming my dad?
Yeah, just about every day. So my dad, like I said, was slow and intentional about everything that he did. So he had a way of putting on his socks and shoes. He'd put on one sock at a time. So I now notice when I'm getting dressed in the morning, I put on one sock, and it's a contemplative moment. I'm thinking about the day, and so I'm sitting there with one sock on and one sock off, just kind of staring off into space. My dad would do that all the time, and then he would put the other sock on, and then he would put one shoe on so he was never really in a hurry. And so I catch myself doing that all the time. My dad, there were a few catchphrases that he had that I picked up on. It's amazing when I go back to Northeast Arkansas. Maybe this happens when you go back to Arkansas the hillbilly accent sort of kicks in.
Yes. Yes. 100%.
And so you work
100%.
hard on correcting it, right? But then you end up in, we're all talking like this,
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And you don't want to be the uppity cousin who sounds like they forgot where they came from,
exactly. So my dad, of course, he had that northeastern Arkansas slang and accent, and so you'd walk in, and after not seeing him for a while, you'd ask, "How you doing, Dad?" And he'd always say, "Pretty good, pretty good." That was his thing, pretty good. And then when you would leave, it would be like, "Y'all don't have to rush off now. What's your hurry?" So he sort of applied that to people being around him as well. And so I pick up on those things every single day. The older I get, the more and I think that's true for all of us. We are the children of our Father and our mother,
Yep.
and it has a way of being reflected in our actions, in our words, and even in our thoughts and philosophies.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing the beautiful story of your dad. He sounds like he was a really smart, brilliant, caring, hardworking person. And it sounds like he lived a really full life. And amazingly, he did not die in that fire. Just amazingly. I just picture this 90-year-old man bursting out of this billowing smoke on this lawnmower with no context whatsoever. Yeah. And I feel like that's exactly how he entered the gates of heaven, was just on a lawnmower, full speed, ride or die, just get through there. And that was his introduction.
And that was another amazing thing. Of course, we happen to be a family of the Christian faith. And when my dad was 66 years of age, my mom called me and said, my dad never went to church, which in a lot of ways, some of us are very thankful for, because, we got to stay home on Sunday night, and he took my brother to see the movies when all of us were having to go to church and things like that. And but when my dad was 66, he had a heart attack, and I think it kind of, startled him a bit. And my mom called and said, "Hey, your dad wants you to baptize him." And so that was a wonderful, wonderful moment for me and for my family when my dad made that public profession of his faith in Christ. And so that was an important moment for us that we always look back on, especially my mom, who was always faithful to church, was always, you think of the devoted Christian woman. I mean, you look it up in the dictionary, it'd be a picture of my mom. And that's who my sweet mother is. And she was so faithful to pray for my dad all of those years. And so that was a wonderful moment. So absolutely, if my dad got in a hurry, it was as he was entering the gates of heaven on that lawnmower.
Yep. And I also think it's an amazing testament to your dad that even after his passing, he's still taking care of your mom every day as she lives in that house. I think that's really, really cool. He built it. He put so much into it that even when he's no longer here to physically care for her, he's still caring for her every day and making sure that she has a literal roof over her head. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, a few years ago, my mom took a tumble and she broke her hip, and she had to spend some time in rehabilitation. So I went home to see them, and I was a little late getting in, and so I went out to the homestead where my dad was, and he met me at the door. And while she was gone, he was keeping the house clean, and he had gone to the Goodwill store, and he was always a bargain shopper, but he was redecorating the house. And there was the ugliest butterfly that you can ever imagine. Big giant butterfly was hanging on the wall. My dad had purchased a $5 floor sweeper, and he was going around the house. I mean, there was sweat dripping off of his nose. He was working so hard. And so he got the butterfly. He was redecorating. He had washed the sheet so I'd have a place to stay. And it was comical. We were trying to put the sheet on the bed. We couldn't do it. So we gave up and went and ate some watermelon. So that was
When in doubt, stop what you're doing and eat watermelon.
There you go.
I feel like that's a very Arkansas lesson.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your father. I think it's wonderful that you have such good memories of him. And I think it's wonderful that, I try to explain to people in the South, we have funerals, but we also have celebrations of life. Right. And I think this is just a great way to celebrate his life. And even though he would have no idea why we want to talk about him or who we are or what we're doing, I think it's a beautiful story. And I really appreciate you sharing those memories with us.
Sydney, thank you so much. It really is an honor to talk about my dad and
Of course.
to share those wonderful memories with you and your audience.
Of course. Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.